Look at this place. Perfect. Thabo swiped his phone, a smirk twisting his face. Zinhle, you were always too small for this world. Poverty looks good on you. He adjusted his silk tie, scanning the grand hall. Empty chairs stared back. Silence, thick and heavy. Where is everyone? Suddenly, the glass walls rattled. A deafening roar of rotors cut through the quiet. Thabo's smirk vanished. He looked up, his face turning pale. The Mbeki crest, he whispered. It can't be. The storm had arrived, and it wasn't for him. Zinhle watched the steam rise from the porcelain cup, the rhythmic clink of the spoon against the rim, the only sound in the vast, cold kitchen. It was a habit born from another life. 5 years ago, the porcelain was chipped, and the tea was the cheapest brand on the shelf. But the small apartment in Hillbrow had felt warm. Back then, Thabo didn't have the tailored silk suits or the calculated arrogance he wore now like armor. He had only a dream, a tattered briefcase, and her. She remembered the long nights when the South African winter seeped through the thin windows of their first home. She had worn simple cotton dresses, the kind that smelled of lemon soap, and the laundry she did by hand to save every cent. She was his silent engine, his midnight editor, his unwavering anchor. She had sold her mother's gold earrings, the only thing she brought from her father's house, to pay the first month's rent on his office. Thabo had wept then, promising her the world. But promises, she observed, are often the first things to rot when the sun gets too bright. Success has a peculiar way of changing a man's eyes. Zinhle noticed it first in the way he stopped looking at her and started looking past her. The we in his sentences slowly eroded into I. She noticed the patterns before he even realized he was leaving. The late nights became the standard, justified by meetings that never appeared on the official calendar. She noticed the new scent that clung to his jackets, a heavy, aggressive floral perfume that felt like an intrusion in their home. It wasn't the scent of a business associate. It was the scent of a conquest. She observed the way he began to handle his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen like a soldier guarding a secret. He thought she was blind because she was quiet. He mistook her patience for a lack of intelligence. In his mind, Zinhle was just the homely wife who didn't fit the high-gloss aesthetic of his new Johannesburg lifestyle. She saw him scrolling through social media, his eyes lingering on women who wore more jewelry than clothes, women who didn't have the calluses on their hands that she had earned building his empire from the dirt up. The luxury of their new mansion in Sandton didn't bring comfort. It brought a sharper, more clinical kind of cruelty. Thabo began to treat her presence like a stain on his expensive marble floors. You don't fit the image anymore, Zinhle, he had muttered one evening, his voice dripping with a disdain he no longer bothered to hide. He looked at her simple, practical clothes and sneered, as if her modesty was a personal insult to his status. He had forgotten the woman who stayed up until dawn proofreading his contracts. He only saw a relic of a past he wanted to bury. Then came the afternoon the silence finally broke. The air in Thabo's study was thick with the smell of his expensive cigars and the heavy scent of betrayal. He didn't look up from his mahogany desk as she entered. He simply tossed a thick white envelope across the polished surface. It slid with a sickeningly smooth sound, stopping right at the edge of the desk. "Sign it," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any trace of the 5 years they had shared. Zinhle didn't reach for the papers. She just stood there, observing the way his jaw tightened, noticing the faint pulse in his neck. "I'm moving on, Zinhle," he said, finally meeting her gaze with eyes that were cold and hollow. "And I need someone who actually belongs in the light. Someone who matches where I'm going, not where I've been." He stood up, towering over her with a manufactured sense of superiority. "You're nothing but a poor anchor, a shackle that's been holding me back from my true glory. Go back to the poverty you came from. You were a mistake I've finally decided to correct." He laughed then, a dry, mocking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He wanted her to cry. He wanted her to beg. But Zinhle felt a strange, clean crack inside her, like glass breaking along a perfectly straight line. She picked up the papers. Her fingers didn't tremble. She noticed the ink on the page looked so final, so permanent. Thabo didn't see the storm brewing behind her calm eyes. He saw a defeated woman retreating into the shadows. He had no idea that the shackle he just unlocked was the only thing that had been keeping his world from falling apart. If only you knew, Thabo, she thought. But her lips remained sealed. She walked out of that house, leaving him to his gilded illusions. The lioness was going home. The blue light of the smartphone screen was the only thing illuminating the darkened room. Zinhle sat perfectly still, the device resting in her palm like a cold glass shard. She observed the notification that had just shattered the quiet of her evening. It was a tag, a public announcement, a digital execution. Thabo had finally done it. She swiped the screen open, her movements deliberate and devoid of haste. The photo was a masterclass in performative luxury. Thabo stood at the center of a sun-drenched terrace in Cape Town, his arm draped possessively around Lorado. Lorado, the woman who called herself an influencer and a socialite, was draped in silk that looked too thin for the coastal breeze. Her smile was practiced, her diamonds catching the light in a way that screamed for attention. But it was the caption that held the true venom. Finally escaped the mud of poverty to reach the diamond, Thabo had written. Some people are meant to be anchors, others are meant to sail. Grateful to finally have a queen who knows the value of the throne. Zinhle noticed the comments beginning to flood in, dozens of hearts, fire emojis, and congratulatory messages from the very people who had sat at her dinner table months ago. She watched as Thabo's new friends, the elite of Johannesburg, mocked her without naming her. They laughed at the poor, simple girl he had left behind. They celebrated his ascent. She felt the weight of the air in the room. It was thick with the irony of a man who believed he had built a mountain when he was actually standing on someone else's shoulders. She didn't cry. Tears require a vulnerability she had long since tucked away. Instead, she noticed the way the moonlight hit the dust motes dancing in the air. She observed the steady rhythm of her own breathing. To the world, she was a discarded woman, a victim of a social climbing husband. To Thabo, she was a ghost he had finally exorcised. A faint, cold smile touched her lips. She stood up and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window. Outside, the vast South African savanna stretched out under the stars, ancient and unbothered by the petty dramas of men. She looked at her reflection in the glass. She didn't see a victim. She saw a strategist who had finished her observations. Thabo's arrogance was his blind spot. He had assumed that because she didn't flaunt, she didn't possess. He had assumed that her silence was a lack of power, rather than the ultimate form of it. She reached into the drawer of the antique side table and pulled out a different phone. It was an older model, encrypted and heavy. It didn't have social media. It didn't have followers. It only had a handful of contacts that the world's most powerful people would give their fortunes to possess. She dialed a number she knew by heart. The ringing was short. Only 2 tones before a deep, resonant voice answered. It was a voice that commanded boardrooms and moved markets across the continent. A voice that had been waiting for this specific call for 5 long years. "Zinhle," the voice asked. There was no judgment, only a father's quiet, lethal patience. Zinhle looked out at the horizon, where the lights of the city met the darkness of the wild. Her voice was as steady as a heartbeat, as sharp as a razor. "Dad," she said quietly, "the game is over. I can come home now." There was a pause on the other end, a heavy, knowing silence. "The plane is already on the way," her father replied. "And Thabo?" Zinhle watched a single bird take flight into the night sky. "Let him have his wedding," she whispered. "Let him believe he's won. I want him to be at the very top of his fake world before I take the floor out from under him." She ended the call. The room returned to its silence, but the energy had shifted. The victim was gone. The heiress had returned. Thabo had posted a photo of a diamond, but he had forgotten one simple rule of the bush. Never mistake a sleeping lioness for a rug. He thought he had reached the light, but he had no idea that the sun was about to set on everything he owned. If only you knew, Thabo. If only you had looked at the woman you called poor and seen the empire she was hiding behind her teeth. The storm was no longer coming. It was here, and it was wearing her face. The view from the penthouse on the 40th floor was a quiet reminder of who actually owned the horizon. Below, the city of Johannesburg was a hive of noise and frantic ambition. But up here, behind the triple-glazed, soundproof glass, there was only the steady hum of controlled power. Zinhle stood by the window, a cup of black coffee in her hand. The steam rose in a perfectly straight line, undisturbed by the silent air conditioning. She had moved in the middle of the night. No drama, no scenes. She had simply walked out with a single suitcase, leaving behind the mansion that Thabo thought was a prize. To him, she had disappeared into the mud of her supposed poverty. In reality, she had just stepped back into her own world. She discarded the simple cotton dresses and the flat-worn shoes of a dutiful wife. In their place were tailored suits from Milan, sharp, dark, and expensive. The kind of wool that didn't just cover the body, but projected a command. As she caught her reflection in the darkened glass, she noticed the change in her own posture. The softness was gone. The woman who sought approval had been replaced by the woman who demanded results. She observed her own hands. They no longer looked like the hands of a servant. They looked like the hands of an owner. The lawyers arrived at exactly 8 a.m. They were the best Cape Town had to offer, men and women whose hourly rates could buy a small car. Yet they stood in her presence with a level of deference they never showed to the city's rising stars. They laid out the documents on the white marble kitchen island, their movements efficient and silent. "It's all here, Ms. Mbeki," the lead attorney whispered, placing a fountain pen beside the files. Zinhle observed the signatures on the contracts. She noticed the patterns of embezzlement Thabo thought he had hidden behind complex shell companies. She scanned the debt records, the massive loans he had taken out against properties he didn't technically own yet. Thabo had been building a castle of cards, and he had used her silence as the foundation. She signed the final injunction with a clean, sharp stroke. Next came the investigators. They didn't speak much. They simply placed a series of photographs and digital transcripts on the table. Zinhle looked at them. Thabo with Lerado at a jewelry store. Thabo bragging at exclusive clubs about how he had finally handled his wife. She felt no pain. Only a cold, clinical sense of observation. It was like looking at a bug under a microscope. "He's planning a grand gala for the wedding," the lead investigator noted. "He's invited the ministers, the CEOs, the old money families. He wants to use the wedding to secure his next round of funding." Zinhle took a slow sip of her coffee, the bitterness grounding her. "He wants an audience," she said quietly. "Then we shall give him one." She didn't call for a press conference. She didn't post a single word on social media. Instead, she sat at her desk and authorized a single private communication. It was sent through a secure encrypted network, used only by the founding families of South African industry, the Mbeki Circle. The message was brief. It didn't contain threats. It didn't need to. It simply stated that the Mbeki family would be observing the attendance list of Thabo's upcoming event with great interest. In the world of high-stakes real estate and mining, interest from the Mbekis was either a blessing or a social death sentence. She noticed the immediate shift in the digital landscape. Within hours, the RSVPs for Thabo's wedding began to drop, quietly, one by one. The illnesses, the last-minute business trips, the scheduling conflicts. The elite of the country knew which side of the bread was buttered. They knew that Thabo was a passing shadow, but the Mbeki name was the sun. Zinhle spent the rest of the week in quiet preparation. She reclaimed the business knowledge she had used to build Thabo's career from the shadows. She observed Thabo's social media from a distance. He was posting more frequently now, his tone becoming increasingly desperate as the A-list guests stopped returning his calls. He didn't understand the silence. He thought it was just bad luck. He had no idea it was a blockade. "Everything is in place," her assistant murmured on Friday evening. Zinhle looked out at the city lights. Not quite, she replied, her voice smooth and dangerous. He still thinks he's the lead actor in this play. I want him to have his moment on stage before the curtain falls. She set her coffee cup down. The clink of the porcelain was the only sound in the room. It was a clean, sharp sound, the sound of a trap being set. Thabo wanted a wedding that would make history. Zinhle was going to make sure he got exactly what he asked for. If only you knew, Thabo. You thought you were trading a poor anchor for a diamond. You didn't realize you were trading your life for a seat at a table that was already being dismantled. The storm was no longer a distant threat. She was the storm, and she was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. The Pretoria sun was brutal. It beat down on the manicured gardens of the estate, turning the white orchids into a blinding glare. Thabo stood at the altar, his silk suit suddenly feeling 3 sizes too small. He observed the long, pristine rows of empty chairs. 200 invitations had been sent. 200 confirmations had been received. Yet, as the clock struck noon, the only things occupying the seats were the shadows of the acacia trees. The silence was absolute. It wasn't just quiet, it was a physical weight pressing against his chest. He noticed a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple, threatening to ruin his perfectly applied foundation. He didn't wipe it. He couldn't. His hands were occupied with his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen with a frantic, desperate energy. He dialed the CEO of a major mining group. Straight to voicemail. He dialed the Minister of Infrastructure. The call was disconnected before the first ring. He noticed the pattern. It wasn't a delay. It was a blackout. He looked at the caterers, who were standing like statues behind tables filled with imported caviar and vintage champagne that no one was drinking. He felt their eyes on him, silent, professional, judgmental. They were observing the man who had just spent the morning posting about his ascent to glory, now standing in a kingdom of ghosts. Beside him, Lerato was a vision of expensive desperation. Her heavy lace veil felt like a shroud. She clutched her bouquet of lilies so tightly the stems were beginning to snap, the green juice staining her white silk gloves. "Thabo, where is the press?" she whispered, her voice cracking through the silence. "The influencers, the photographers, they were supposed to be here an hour ago. We have a schedule. We have sponsors." Thabo didn't look at her. He stared at the empty driveway, his eyes searching the horizon for a single sign of a motorcade. "They're coming," he hissed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Traffic is a mess. Accidents on the N1. They're coming. We are the center of the country today, Lerato. Everyone who is anyone is on their way. Just be patient." He picked up a crystal champagne flute from a passing tray, but the crystal clinked rhythmically against his teeth. He noticed the tremor in his fingers. He swallowed hard, his throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. The heat was intensifying, and the smell of the wilting flowers began to cloy, heavy and sweet, like a funeral. He glanced at his watch again. 12:45 p.m. The ceremony was supposed to have ended by now. He began to scroll through his social media feed, looking for any mention of his wedding. Nothing. The silence on his phone was even louder than the silence in the garden. He noticed that the likes on his earlier post, the one mocking Zinhle, had stopped growing. It was as if the world had collectively decided he no longer existed. He felt a sharp, cold prickle of anxiety at the base of his spine. Why was the road silent? Where were the sirens, the security details, the roar of luxury engines? Then, the sound changed. It was low at first, a rhythmic, heavy vibration that rattled the crystal on the tables. Thabo stood taller, a flash of his old arrogance returning. He smoothed his jacket, his chest puffing out. "You see," he said, a jagged smile cutting across his face. "I told you. They're here. Probably a police escort for the deputy president." He adjusted his cufflinks, his posture shifting back into the role of the conqueror. He expected a motorcade of a dozen black SUVs. He expected the flashing lights and the chaos of the South African elite arriving in force. He expected his total vindication. But as the dust cleared at the entrance of the estate, only one vehicle appeared. It wasn't a fleet of Ferraris or G-Wagons. It was a single, obsidian black Mercedes Pullman. It moved with a slow, predatory grace, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh light like armor. It didn't stop where the other guests were supposed to park. It drove straight onto the grass, the heavy tires crushing the carefully placed floral arrangements and the white carpet. It stopped exactly 10 paces from the altar, the engine idling with a deep, expensive growl that seemed to vibrate in Thabo's very bones. The engine died, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Thabo's smirk faltered. He noticed the crest on the door, a subtle gold-embossed seal he hadn't seen in years. A seal that represented a wealth so old and so vast, it didn't need to shout. His face went white, the color of the empty chairs around him. His mouth went dry and the ringing in his ears became deafening. He looked at Lorado, but she was staring at the car with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. The back door opened. A single shoe stepped onto the grass. A handcrafted leather brogue that cost more than Thabo's entire wedding budget. Thabo's hand went to his throat. He recognized the silhouette emerging from the darkness of the car. He recognized the sheer gravity-defying power of the man stepping out. He realized in that freezing moment that he hadn't invited a guest. He had invited a judge, and the trial was about to begin. Thabo rushed forward, ignoring the sweat that had now ruined his silk collar. He didn't see the danger. He only saw a lifeline. "Mr. Mbeki," he called out, his voice cracking with a forced, oily enthusiasm. "Sir, it is an honor. I knew you would make it. The traffic in Pretoria is a nightmare, isn't it?" He reached out a hand, expecting a handshake that would validate his entire existence. Mr. Mbeki didn't look at his hand. He didn't look at the expensive floral arrangements or the hollow grandeur of the altar. He stood there, a mountain of a man in a bespoke charcoal suit, his presence sucking the air out of the garden. He observed Thabo with a look of profound, quiet disgust, the kind of look one gives a mosquito before crushing it. The sound of the slap was louder than the helicopter rotors had been. It was clean, sharp, and final. Thabo's head snapped back, his glasses skidding across the white carpet into a pile of wilting lilies. Silence fell over the estate, so absolute that the buzzing of a distant fly sounded like a roar. "I am not here to celebrate, Thabo," Mr. Mbeki said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of tectonic plates shifting. "I am here to audit." He stepped closer, his shadow engulfing the smaller man. "I am here to take back every cent, every brick, and every thread that my daughter allowed you to borrow to play this pathetic game of dress-up." Thabo stumbled back, clutching his face, his eyes darting toward the car in a state of total disorientation. And then, she stepped out. Zinhle didn't walk. She commanded the space. She was draped in midnight blue silk that flowed like water, her hair styled in a sharp modern crown that caught the afternoon sun. The simple girl from Hillbrow was gone. In her place stood the heiress to the Mbeki empire, her eyes like polished obsidian. She stood beside her father, her silence more deafening than any scream. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence was the verdict. Thabo looked at her, his mouth hanging open, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Zinhle?" he whispered, his voice trembling. What is this? Who are you?" She didn't answer immediately. She simply observed the way his knees were beginning to give way. She noticed the frantic pattern of his pulse in his neck. With the clinical precision, she reached back into the car and pulled out a leather-bound folder. She didn't hand it to Thabo. She handed it to the man standing in the front row. Not a guest, but the lead investigator of the Commercial Crimes Unit. "Embezzlement," the investigator announced, his voice echoing through the empty rows of chairs. 18 counts of money laundering through shell companies, all funded by Mbeki Holdings' private reserves. Funds reserved for the daughter's trust, which you thought you had accessed through a loophole. Zinhle finally spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, and utterly cold. It was the voice of a woman who had spent years watching a man dig his own grave. You called me a shackle, Thabo. You said I belonged in the mud. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the marble path with the rhythm of a ticking clock. But you forgot one thing. The mud is what makes the foundation. And I just pulled yours out. The sound of sirens began to wail from the estate gates. 3 black police vans swept up the driveway, their blue lights flashing against the white orchids, turning the wedding into a crime scene. Thabo looked around wildly, searching for an escape, for a friend, for anything. He turned to Lerato, grabbing her arm. Lerato, tell them we're together. Tell them about the business. Lerato didn't look at him. She was already unpinning her heavy veil, her eyes focused on the exit with a predatory sharpness. She noticed the handcuffs glinting in the sun as the officers approached. Together? She sneered, her voice sharp and brittle. I don't even know this man. He told me he was an orphan with a massive fortune. If I'd known he was a common thief, I never would have stepped foot in this place. She dropped her bouquet of lilies into the dirt and walked toward the gate, not once looking back at the man she was supposed to marry. Thabo fell to his knees on the white carpet. He looked at the empty chairs, the cold champagne, the wilting flowers. He looked at the woman who had once loved him and now looked at him like he was a stain on her floor. The silence of the garden returned, but this time it was the silence of a grave. Zinhle turned her back on him, the silk of her dress whispering against the grass as she walked back to the Pullman. She didn't look back to see him being led away. She had finished her observation. The trial was over. Justice had arrived, and it didn't even need to raise its voice. The storm had passed, Yao leaving nothing but the wreckage of a man who thought he could outrun his own shadow. Zinhle stood on the terrace of the Mbeki Tower, the highest point in Johannesburg. From this height, the world looked different. The frantic noise of the streets, the desperate scramble for status, the lies whispered in the dark. It all felt small, insignificant. She leaned against the cold steel railing, observing the way the city lights flickered below like dying embers. The air was crisp, carrying the faint, clean scent of the high-veiled rain. She looked at her hands. They were steady. For 5 years, she had played a role that didn't belong to her. She had shrunk her spirit to fit into the narrow spaces Thabo provided. She had been the poor anchor, the quiet wife, the background noise to his loud manufactured symphony. How he thought he had outsmarted her because she chose to stay silent. He didn't realize that her silence wasn't a lack of words. It was a surplus of observation. A soft chime came from her tablet, resting on a marble table nearby. She didn't rush to check it. She took a slow sip of her tea, noticing the way the heat spread through her chest. Finally, she swiped the screen. A new notification. It wasn't a news report about Thabo's arrest or a frantic apology from a former friend. It was a contract. The Northern Cape expansion. A multi-billion-dollar green energy project that would reshape the country's infrastructure. It was her project. Not Thabo's. Not her father's. Hers. She noticed the signature line at the bottom, waiting for her name. No husband's consent required. No partner to share the credit. Just Zinhle Mbeki. Or she felt a faint smile touch her lips. Not a smile of triumph, but of arrival. She didn't feel the need to watch the world burn. She didn't need to see the photos of Thabo in the back of a police van or the video of Lerato running from the press. That was yesterday's business. And Zinhle was already living in tomorrow. She realized then that the greatest revenge wasn't the downfall of her enemies. It was the fact that they no longer occupied a single second of her thoughts. Society often mistakes a woman's grace for fragility. They see a quiet heart and assume it is a hollow one. They see patience and mistake it for a lack of options. But they forget that the deepest rivers move with the least noise. Thabo wanted a queen who matched his throne, but he was too blind to see that Zinhle owned the land the throne was built on. He thought he was trading a shackle for a diamond, never realizing he was the one being discarded. Grace isn't weakness, she whispered to the wind, her voice like silk over stone. It's control. It was the final lesson of her journey. When you push a silent woman to her limit, you don't get a scream. You don't get a scene. You get a reckoning. You get the bill for every lie, every insult, and every moment of stolen dignity. And in her world, that bill always comes due. She turned away from the edge of the balcony, leaving the city lights behind. She had an empire to run, a future to build, and a life that was finally, truly her own. The storm had passed and the air was finally clear. If this story touched you, if you believe that every woman deserves to be seen for her strength and not just her service, then let it be a reminder. Never mistake silence for surrender. If you stand with Zinhle and women everywhere who are reclaiming their power, please like and share this video. Because sometimes, the best way to deal with a world that tries to make you small is to simply grow so big that they can no longer reach you. Thank you for watching. Your value is not defined by who stays, but by who you are when everyone else is gone. Keep your grace. Keep your control. The horizon belongs to you.